From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Tensions grow between the Biden administration and the Israeli government over Rafah and Gaza. The Jewish state expands its operations in Rafah, the last Hamas stronghold in the Gaza territory, while the State Department issues a report critical of Israel's conduct during the war, but stopping short of saying it actually violated international law. Meanwhile, opposition builds in the United States in both parties to President Biden's withholding of weapons from Israel and his threat of a larger arms embargo if Israel goes into Rafah. Welcome to Potomac Watch, the podcast of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. I'm Paul Gigot, the editor of the editorial page, and I'm here with my colleagues Elliot Kaufman and Kim Strassel. Let's start today by listening to some of the commentary in the weekend and Secretary of State Antony Blinken talk on CBS's Face the Nation about the message he is delivering to Israel.
As we look at Rafah, they may go in and have some initial success, but potentially at an incredibly high cost to civilians, but one that is not durable, one that's not sustainable. And they will be left holding the bag on an enduring insurgency because a lot of armed Hamas will be left, no matter what they do in Rafah. Or if they leave and get out of Gaza, as we believe they need to do, then you're going to have a vacuum, and a vacuum that's likely to be filled by chaos, by anarchy, and ultimately by Hamas again. Yeah. So we've been working for many weeks on developing credible plans for security, for governance, for rebuilding. We haven't seen that come from Israel. We've been working with Arab countries and others on that plan. We need to see that too. We have the same objective as Israel. We want to make sure that Hamas cannot govern Gaza again.
Have the same objective as Israel, wanting to make sure Hamas can't govern. Two parts to this answer, Elliot, on his part. I mean, we take them separately. One is this big debate over how to prosecute the end game here in Gaza and whether to go into Rafah. And then secondarily, how to win the peace after the war is presumably won. But let's take the first one first. What do you make of the Blinken critique of the Israeli war plan and his essentially assertion that what Israel plans, they can't win? They will not be able to destroy Hamas, and Hamas will inherit Gaza in any event.
You know, that's something that he has said to Israeli officials from the start, in fact. Before the evidence came in on Israeli fighting, his position was, you can't win, and therefore don't even bother. Don't go in ground forces into any part of Gaza, in fact. And so Rafah is the latest part. You know, Israel took Gaza City faster than people had anticipated. It then fought on to Khan Yunis, won there. Now you have Hamas's last major stronghold where it has formal military battalions, where it governs the territory, where until Israel went in, it had control over all the aid coming in. So what do you want to see in Rafah? What do you want to see in Gaza as a whole? If you want Hamas in charge, well, then he's right. Tell Israel, stay out. Don't fight there. Certainly don't fight in any kind of serious way. But if you want a possibility of some other Rafah, of some other Gaza, well, then Israel has to fight there.
Well, what about his argument that, in fact, all you're going to get is chaos and anarchy if you go in? Because his assumption seems to be that it's impossible to actually defeat Hamas. It seems to me that it's certainly impossible to defeat Hamas if you don't try to defeat Hamas by going in to Rafah. But if you do go in, at least you do have a chance to do so. And of course, as long as you don't kill, for example, Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attack, you are essentially conceding defeat to Israel and its war aims.
Right. And I mean, it's worth looking at the operation against Rafah as it stands right now. I mean, Israeli troops are advancing and have taken a pretty significant amount of territory in eastern Rafah as well, and are already starting to push into the more central eastern parts of Rafah. They have evacuated perhaps 400,000 civilians already from Rafah, certainly more than 350,000. They've done that remarkably quickly and taken the territory faster and with far fewer civilian casualties than the U.S. had anticipated. So it's been a success so far. They're going to push it forward. I mean, I think Blinken is right when he says that some Hamas will survive and will fight on as a kind
terrorist
of
force,
insurgency,
yeah.
a terrorist force. But the question is, do you want them fighting in cells of 3 or 4, or do you want them fighting as formal military battalions? Would you like a vacuum, or would you like unquestioned Hamas rule? Those are the alternatives right now. And if he's serious about, in objective, defeating Hamas, I think he's going to have to go along with this creeping Israeli advance in Rafah.
Kim, you've looked at the State Department report that was issued on Friday, which was compelled by President Biden to examine Israel's conduct of the war and to make a judgment about whether or not that conduct and the use of American weapons in that conduct is consistent with international norms and law. How do you read that report?
Yeah, this report, by the way, was ordered by the president back in February. It told the State Department and the Pentagon to provide an assessment to Congress on this question of whether or not Israel had specifically violated international humanitarian law. The bottom line of this report, and I think it's very important that everyone understand this because there's a lot of other words that are being used to describe it. The bottom line is that they have not provided concrete evidence that Israel has indeed violated international law. It fails to say that it has broken those rules. Instead, what it provided was, and I'll use some words from Senator Tom Cotton here, some kind of weaselly words, mealy-mouthed words saying, well, it's our judgment that there might be reasonable evidence to conclude it might have broken some laws. But the problem is wartime conditions are such that we cannot be sure. In specific, the report said that it could not link specific U.S. weapons to specific individual attacks in which civilians had died. Instead, what it is saying is that our judgment is that this looks a bit beyond proportional and that we're kind of just guessing that there's a problem here because there's been some high levels of civilian casualties. Well, in my mind, Paul, that's not enough. This is a brutal and bloody war in very challenging circumstances. As we know, Hamas has burrowed miles and miles of tunnels. It often involves some very powerful bombs to try to dismantle those. There has been some civilian casualties. The question needs to be whether or not there has been intention or wanton behavior by Israel that has created more casualties than would otherwise be justified in the conduct of this war. And I think it's important that that report could not provide that evidence.
We're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we'll have more discussion of Israel's conduct of the war and the emerging brawl between the U.S. and Israel when we come back. Welcome back. My name is Paul Gigot. I'm here in Potomac Watch with Kim Strassel and Elliot Kaufman. Elliot, Kim's good summary of the State Department report on Israel before the break demonstrates what is kind of the ambivalence, if not ambivalence, at least the contradictions of U.S. policy here. They seem to want to have it both ways. They want to criticize Israel, probably in part for domestic reasons. The president's domestic anti-Israel part of his political base. But on the other hand, they don't want to basically go full-throatedly in opposition to Israel. So you're left with this ambiguity about what the U.S. strategy really is, as well as some real doubt about the degree of our support.
Right. And to different audiences, there is a different message. I mean, the Biden administration has tried to justify this latest arms embargo, as we've called it, by saying that it would bring a hostage deal closer, for instance. But everyone who looks at this objectively says the problem has been Hamas rejecting hostage deals. Hamas sees all of this U.S. pressure on Israel. Why should it make a deal now? And no surprise, I hear hostage talks are pretty much dead at the moment. If they will be revived and if this war will come to an end, it'll be with what I think, again, reasonable people have said from the start, which is with Israeli military pressure on Hamas, Israeli military victory. Only then, at that point, Hamas will say, let's make a deal. Let's try to bring this to an end. I think that right there is the Biden goal. Bring this to an end. At the start, they, talked about Israeli victory. These days, you don't hear them talking about it so much. They want to bring it to an end whichever way they can. If they're talking to a pro-Israel audience, they'll say it involves the defeat of Hamas. If they're not talking to a pro-Israel audience, they will leave that part out. But I don't even think what they're doing is bringing the war to an end. I think it's actually dragging it out longer and longer to the detriment of all sides.
Let's listen to Arkansas Republican Senator Tom Cotton, also on CBS's Face the Nation, addressing the reports of the arms embargo against Israel.
Joe Biden said last week that he's going to stop supplying offensive weapons that can be used in an urban setting. That is the only setting in Gaza. That is the only setting in Gaza. And they have to go into Rafah. Joe Biden's position is de facto for Hamas victory at this point. Israel's goal is to destroy Hamas, which committed the worst atrocity against Jews since World War II. Hamas's goal is to survive. If Israel does not go into Rafah and destroy Hamas in Rafah, Hamas will survive.
Kim, the opposition to Biden's policy here, particularly the news of the arms embargo, has been building in both parties. Bernie Sanders, for example, is delighted by it. He's come out forthright, said it's terrific. Chris Van Hollen, Maryland senator who is emerging as one of the leading anti-Israel voices in Congress, loves it. But there's bipartisan opposition as well emerging, certainly from Republicans, as Tom Cotton's comments illustrated. But there's also opposition from John Fetterman, the Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, and others that has emerged. How is this breaking down politically within the Democratic Party and more broadly in Congress?
Yeah, this is very difficult for the Democratic Party, and that split is only widening as Republicans seek to put more attention on this. Last week, Senator Lindsey Graham put forward a resolution. It was signed on to by all Senate Republicans, save Rand Paul, who obviously has different views on foreign engagement, but it condemned the administration's decision to withhold these weapons. On Friday in the afternoon, that had compelled 26 House Democrats to send a letter to the president saying they were deeply concerned about the message the administration was sending to Hamas by withholding these munitions. I actually read, and this is a Democrat, Richie Torres from New York, asked about this, said, "I suspect it's pandering to the far left. It looks like election year politics to me." And so that's some of the blowback he's getting. As you noted, Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania came out on news of this. He said, "A hard disagree and deeply disappointing." And Republicans are really going to push this week. The House GOP is going to put forward a resolution that mirrors the one in the Senate. It's more likely to get a vote. Chuck Schumer may not bring up the Senate one. But Republicans are also going to put a bill on the floor, the Israeli Security Assistance Support Act, that's going to prohibit the administration from withholding aid from Israel, saying that weapons have to be shipped in 15 days and enforcing it by restricting some dollars to the Pentagon and State Department if it doesn't happen. How that vote breaks down, that's going to put enormous pressure on more Democrats to actually step back from the president and condemn him here because of the election environment. And the reality is that while Biden is pandering to the far left, that is not the majority of the country. And the polls show that American will is still very much with Israel and an Israeli victory. And so I do think overall the president is splitting his party and courting public backlash with all of this.